Good morning, everyone, and thank you for that kind introduction, and it's been a great event so far. Thank you, Adiosola, for that. Really excited to be here with everyone, wherever you are in the world. I wish I was back in Lagos, but I am today, right now in Canada. In my 12 minutes this morning, morning in Canada, I want to talk about, TEDx is all about big ideas, and I have one big idea to share with you this morning. And that big idea is trying to shift from a GDP lens to a sustainable development goal lens, and also a flourishing lens. And the idea is if we do that, we will start to make significant progress around the world, and particularly in Africa. But let me start by, what is a lens? A lens is how we frame the world. We use so many lenses every day to make sense of the world, to think about a problem, to think about solutions, to think about responses, what's feasible, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. And we all have so many of these lenses. They come from our culture, from our nation, from our religion, from our individual experiences on that. But these lenses are critical because they shape the narrative and they shape how we do things. So what's the lens I want to talk about? I'm an economist, as you saw on there, and I want to talk about a lens we use to think about the economy that I think does tremendous damage around the world. This lens is the GDP lens. So people like GDP, gross domestic product. People like me stand up every day and talk about GDP numbers. We talk about the growth rate in China. We talk about the growth rate in India. There's a recession in Africa. I've stood up so many times and said, Nigeria is not growing fast enough. Africa is not growing fast enough. South Africa is not growing fast enough. So it becomes the language that we use to understand the problem. And then it becomes what the policymakers think about and what policies they design to get faster GDP growth. But here's the problem. GDP is not our objective. You can't eat GDP. It doesn't connect people. What we're really after is the well-being of people. That's the objective of the economy. Why do we do all these things? Because we want people to have better lives, to have good lives. So if we're using the GDP lens, we must be using it because we think that there's a relationship between the GDP and the well-being of people. But that's not in fact true. The relationship between GDP and the well-being of people is actually pretty tenuous. And it's something that we need to talk more about, and it's the main purpose of me being with you here today. So you may have a high GDP, but health, education, happiness may not be very good. And I'll give some examples of that. And of course, health, education, happiness are what we really mean by well-being. Or we may have a high GDP in a country, but it's not very evenly distributed. So we look at the United States, we look at South Africa, we look at Nigeria, there are places where GDP is highly unequally distributed. So I said, let me give you a few examples of this. I'm speaking to you from Canada. I'm Canadian, though I've lived in Lagos for more than a decade. So the US GDP per capita is about 63,000 US dollars, and life expectancy is 79 years. Well, that's well below every other developed country. In Canada, we only have a GDP of $46,000, so a lot lower than the United States. And yet our life expectancy is 83 years, much, much higher. But this can be even more stark for developing countries. So if we look, for example, at South Africa, which is the largest economy, second largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa, the GDP per capita is almost 6,400 US dollars. But life expectancy is too short. It's only 65 years. India has a per capita income of only 2,000 US dollars, but has a life expectancy of over 70. So in effect, what India is doing is taking its wealth, its GDP, and turning into well-being at a much higher rate than South Africa. Canada is turning its wealth into a much better outcome on life expectancy than the United States. So let's look at another measure. So let's talk about absolute poverty. So I just said that India has a GDP of only about 2,000 US dollars, and yet it has an extreme poverty rate of 3%, which is an excellent, I mean, they've done a fantastic job over the last 30 years of reducing extreme poverty. Nigeria, my home, has the same GDP per capita of about 2,000 US dollars. And yet we're the poverty capital of the world. We have over 100 million people in extreme poverty, about 50% of the population, which means that the efficiency of turning this GDP into a well-being outcome, so no people in extreme poverty, is much, much higher in India than it is in Nigeria. So why are we talking about GDP all the time? How about education? So PISA is an important measure that developed countries use to look at their performance in the education system. And every country understands education is critical on this. So you'd think that people would really focus on turning their GDP into a good educational outcome. But this turns out not to actually to be true. So Estonia, a small country in the Baltic Sea, has a GDP of only $23,000, one of the lowest among the developed countries. And yet it has the second highest country ranking in terms of educational outcomes. Poland has about 15,000 GDP, even lower than Estonia. And yet it has the 9th best outcome in terms of education among developed countries. And then we look at some countries that are wealthy in GDP terms. So Australia, $57,000 GDP per capita, never had a recession until now for 30 years, is 19th in these rankings. And our poor friends, the United States, so wealthy, but so many challenges, particularly today. With their $64,000 GDP per capita, come a distant 15th in that. Of course, right now, all over the world, we're dealing with the terrible COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm sure all of you see, we're comparing countries all the time. What strategies are working best? What's keeping people safe? What's working to keep the economy moving while we keep people safe? It's really too early to know what are the best strategies. But as we look around the world, we already see big differences in deaths per million. So the United States, about 300. Belgium has had a very hard time, 800 deaths per million. South Korea has done much, much better at only 5. Russia is growing, but it's still under 30. Italy over 500, UK over 500. So many tragic deaths around the world. But let's compare this to Kerala. This is a state in southern India. It has a population of about 35 million people. There are only 7 confirmed deaths in Kerala, and it's now being held up as a model of how to deal with COVID-19. This means that the death rate per million is about 0.2. I just told you that in the United States, the number was over 300. So this place, Kerala, is having a death rate that's less than 1/1,000 of the death rate in the United States. And yet Kerala has a GDP per capita of only $3,200, or about 1/20th of the United States, and less than 1/10 of every other developed country. There's no fluke in Kerala. They have 99% literacy rate, life expectancy of 75 years, which is greater than 3 of the states in the United States. So we see a wide difference across the ability to turn GDP into human well-being. And let me not finish the talk, but finish this part of the discussion with an example from Nigeria, which really struck me. We all know that life expectancy in Nigeria is far too low. The official number, I believe, is about 53. And it's an urgent task for Nigeria to increase this number. But some states are richer than others. Per capita GDP in Lagos is probably 5 to 8 times per capita income in the Northwest political zone. A vast difference. And you might expect this would translate into more well-being for Lagosians. While this is truly likely true in some dimensions, on life expectancy, it turns out not to be true. According to the numbers I found, life expectancy in Lagos is 53 years. So it means despite having 6 to 8 times more GDP per capita, extraordinarily life expectancy is the same. So we've seen so many examples where we're not turning wealth into well-being. So how do we move from this GDP lens that we're so obsessed with around the world to something else? I think the alternative is really just 2 different lenses, one for developing countries, one for more developed countries. For developing countries, my argument is that the UN Sustainable Development Goals are just a fantastic innovation that we need to really embrace and start to measure and use to do policy. You can see them up on your screen right now. The thing about the development goals is, as I said, GDP is not well-being, but the development goals really capture what well-being is all around. No poverty, that matters. 0 hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, clean water. These are measurable things that are related to the well-being of people all over the world. on that. And so this is a framework that we can all start to use, that we can all start to galvanize around, to move our lens and make a real difference to policy and what policymakers do in countries like Nigeria and around the world. Now, of course, the question you might ask is, if it's so obvious that the GDP lens is not optimal for human well-being, why is it so difficult to dislodge? Why do people like me stand up every day, the newspapers, the headlines, GDP growth? The reason for it is because it's really something that more expresses what business perspective, the total pie that businesses can pursue. And to put it bluntly, rich people, the 1%, the 0.1%, the 0.01%, they're the ones that are interested in the GDP lens. But for the rest of us, we need to make sure that we're moving our lens from something that doesn't matter to the welfare of people, that something does. So let me, before closing, touch briefly on, I said there was a different lens for developed countries. Many of the issues that we see in the Sustainable Development Goals obviously are doing much better in developed countries. So I have a different lens for a developed country. That lens is something I call flourishing. You know, that what people should be measuring is, are people flourishing? And if some of the speakers today have talked about flourishing as a concept. Some of the clips we saw have talked about it. So why is flourishing important? Because flourishing really captures what it is to be human. We're on a growth journey. It's dynamic, it's through time, it's part of a system. So while an SDG lens might be appropriate for developing nations, where we need to worry more about no hunger, clean water, it's not ambitious enough for a developed nation. But let me stop there. The big idea I want to leave you with is we use a GDP lens far too much around the world. And if we started to use a Sustainable Development Goal lens, particularly for developing countries, we'd find that the welfare of our people in Nigeria, in sub-Saharan Africa, around the world would increase. So thank you so much, and God bless Nigeria, God bless Africa.